So you touched on this earlier, but critics sometimes say media coverage can influence juror perception or prosecutorial decision making. How do courts attempt to insulate a jury from external narratives in such high-profile cases like this? It's all over the news. How do we insulate a jury from knowing all of these facts?
There's a lot of different tools, as we say, the court can do. The most important that comes to mind is the voir dire. And what that means is when the potential jurors come in, they, at some cases, are given written questions ahead of time. So the attorneys will have those written questions, potentially like, have you heard about this case? What do you know? Do you have any, family members that were killed? Do you have any family members that have mental health? Try and get as much information as possible from the potential jurors to see if they can be fair and impartial, because that is key. A juror can't come in there with a pre-existing idea. Now, if someone comes in and says, I know 100% he is innocent, I know 100% he is guilty, and I can't be persuaded any other way because I saw this TikTok video, or I know someone who knows someone and they know the intel, then that is not justice. That is not giving someone on the jury who is fair and impartial. And then also, each attorney has the opportunity potentially to ask questions of the potential jurors as well, and the judge as possible, depending on what the judge decides to do, whether it's the judge will ask questions, but also to give each side the opportunity. And if someone on the jury could say that, I can't be fair and impartial, then the one side can challenge that. Also, the attorneys as well not only can challenge for cause as well, but they also get peremptory strikes. And so what that means is they can decide this person in the either prosecution or defendant believe that juror cannot be fair and impartial, and so they can strike the juror as well. Now, another tool that the court could use is sequester the jurors. That's somewhat severe, and have the jurors somewhere they all go together and stay in a hotel and then come back as well. But then also the judge can also have instructions to the jurors as well in the beginning that you should only look at the evidence, and that opening statements are not evidence, and that the defendant is innocent until proven guilty, and that the prosecution at the initial stage of the charges has to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And another thing as well, that they could potentially try and file a motion, the defendants, to transfer the case to a different venue, a different location. I don't know if that's going to happen in the case, but could say that this jury pool, for being in Los Angeles, is too familiar for this case, and that we want to go and have the trial in a different county. So there's a lot of tools both sides can use in order to make sure that the trial is fair.
It's incredible. That's quite a process. I mean, that's truly, in our time of social media, everybody has all the information right at their fingertips. It's going to be hard to find people who just are impartial and completely, that's incredible. So that's good that those tools are fascinating.
All the evidence is important, but when we look at it from a standpoint, DNA is really important. And why is DNA so important? Because the DNA can help substantiate the fact that someone was there, whether it's like blood stains or some kind of marking and stuff like that. So DNA in these type of cases is always important. But nowadays, with technology and everyone has their phone, there's certain kind of tracking to see where someone goes or where someone left. Also, there supposedly in the Nick Reiner matter, there are surveillance videos from different places after his parents were killed, and showing his moveabouts and stuff like that. So all this type of evidence is definitely going to be key. And then also to your point about the mental health, it could definitely play a role, whether it's documents from psychiatrists or the fact that he switched his medicine. those kind of things are definitely important as well.
Yes. And in the context of this case in particular, what role do family statements, public sentiment, of course, the Reiners are huge, and the victim's legacy play in legal strategy on both sides?
I say there's two courtrooms, the courtroom of the public opinion and then the court of law. And so they're different, but it goes to the first point, the court of public opinion. A lot of people have strong opinions, but as a juror, it's important for them to put that aside and be fair and impartial. And in the court of law, ultimately, the jurors will decide someone's guilt or innocence, and they will weigh all the evidence. They will look at all the evidence. They will weigh the credibility of someone testifying and look at the totality of the circumstances in the court of law and ultimately base their decision on that.
Nick Reiner collaborated creatively with his father on a film project in the past. In a case like this, can prior public collaborations or a documented close relationship between a defendant and the alleged victims become relevant in court? And if so, how?
It could definitely play a role, and each side could potentially use it for their own narrative. In opening statement, each side, the prosecution and defense, gets to tell their story, as we say, and tell about their side of things, their perspective. And so this could potentially be used by the defense to kind of highlight their relationship and what it was like and what was going on. And the prosecution could potentially use that as well. But the prosecution, now it's important to remember, people always think like, why did someone do something? What exactly was their motive? That is not an element of the crime, but people always think that. And so you think, well, why did someone do something? What was their motive? What was the reasoning behind what they did? But motive is not an element of the charges. And going back to your point about that, if it is relevant for either side, the prosecution or the defendant, I could definitely see them bringing that forward to highlight their story, potentially in the opening statements, or to have a witness testify it to paint their side of their story.
Do you think a plea deal is realistically on the table for this? What do you think prosecutors would seek in exchange for taking that off the table? I mean, you just mentioned life in prison. Do you think that would be an exchange?
That could
a likely exchange.
Sure, that is possible, that he would spend the rest of his life in prison without parole. Now, they're in plea deals is potentially a negotiation. So if that happens, if that's what the prosecution offers, defendants could say, well, look, there is mitigating circumstances for this plea deal, and there is been reported that there's mental health issues, and so that should mitigate some of the time and potentially try and negotiate a deal. It might not happen in this case and go to trial. We're going to have to wait and see how it plays out in the court of law.
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, we don't know yet what's going to happen. Prosecutors have not yet said whether they will seek the death penalty. California has a moratorium on executions, even though the death penalty still remains legal. How does that shape how prosecutors and defense attorneys approach a case like this?
Well, from the standpoint of the defense, they understand that even though if that's the case, that it most likely will not happen. But from the prosecution standpoint, they're still putting it out there that they're still considering it. And if in fact they do decide to go forward with that, before the jury is selected, they are asked questions about whether in fact at some point in time could they impose the death penalty. So that could potentially change the dynamic of the jury pool for the jurors that sit, because they have already said that if in fact the death penalty is on the table, they can consider it.
Thank you so much again. This I found really interesting. His attorney at one point was high-profile defense lawyer Alan Jackson, but Jackson withdrew in early January, and Reiner now has a public defender. What are the legal implications when defense counsel changes, especially in a murder prosecution this serious?
There could be a lot of things. We can only speculate because an attorney owes a duty of confidentiality to the client. So we're probably not going to know what exactly the reason is, but it's important to remember his former attorney came out and said something along the lines that Nick Reiner is not guilty of the charges. Now, it could potentially be at some point there was the attorney realized that there was a potential conflict in the case and that couldn't decide to do it. It could have been economic of the cost of the expense to do it. Unfortunately, we won't know the answer to that, but he does now have a public defender. And when I was in law school, I was a certified public defender. And public defenders are great attorneys. They are very familiar with the criminal justice system. This is what they focus on. And I truly believe that he will be adequately represented, because that's something that's really important. But it's also going to takes the new attorney to get up to speed, as we say. So the former attorney to give him information and to get up to speed. And so that's what takes a little bit of time when the transition from one attorney to another attorney in a case, and especially in such a high-profile case. For the insanity defense, that is going to be key, but it's also important to remember in California, it would be a bifurcated trial. And what that means is the prosecution would bring their case, and they would have to prove his guilt, Nick Reiner's guilt, beyond a reasonable doubt. Like, that is the burden. So the jurors sit there, and beyond a reasonable doubt, they believe that he committed the crime. Once that happens, then the burden shifts to the defendant, and it's a lower standard, preponderance of the evidence. And so the defense would have to prove reasonable insanity defense. And how they would do that is by experts. And that would be during the time of the trial. And to your point, they would potentially have doctors testify about his medicine and potentially how he changed. But it's important to remember that the insanity defense is basically you did not know from right or wrong. So at that point of the alleged killing, he didn't understand right or wrong due to his mental health. And if the jury comes back and believes that, then he could potentially, rather than go to prison, go to a mental facility.
Yes. So you just mentioned this, but I'm curious, there is a difference between competency to stand trial and the insanity defense. Can you explain a little bit more that distinction and how each would unfold procedurally?
It's all about the timing. So when you talk about the competency to stand trial, that would mean that at the time of the trial, someone is competent enough to stand trial and understand the procedure, understand what's going on. Now, if in fact it is determined that he doesn't have the competency to stand trial, then usually the judge will stop the case, stop the procedures, kind of put like a stop in order to give the defendant time to seek mental health, potentially whether it's get new medicine or different medicine, and then that has to deal with the competency to stand trial. Now, when we're talking about the insanity defense, that timeline is at the time of the alleged murder. At that time, did you have the wherewithal? Did you have the knowledge? did you have the competency to truly understand your own actions? And that, at that point, if that's when the defendants, by the preponderance of the evidence, after Nick Reiner has been found guilty by the jury, would come into play, and you would have experts testify, talking about mental health, talking about the new medicine, potentially looking over the logs and the notes from his time with a psychiatrist, potentially have some celebrity witnesses at the party, maybe potentially to help establish his behavior, how Nick reacted at the party, what did they notice, was everything fine, was everything normal, just to kind of give a timeline of what exactly happened and Nick Reiner's mental state from an observation perspective, from someone seeing him.